Well, good afternoon and welcome to the latest in the series of IED webinars. I'm Greg Ward, a member of the IED board, and I'll be chairing this session today. I would like to welcome our panellists, Professor Kieran Trehan, Pro-Vice Chancellor for Partnerships and Engagement at the University of York, Mark Pearson, Head of Knowledge Exchange and Enterprise, Research and Innovation, Royal Holloway, University of London, and John Guest, Senior Economic Policy Manager, Sheffield City Region. Our panel will be sharing their thoughts and insights on how economic development professionals can work more effectively with higher education institutions to drive growth. If you have a question for the panel, please could you use the Q&A function rather than the chat, and we will try and answer as many in the time that we have. If we don't get through all of the questions and comments raised, then we will follow up after the webinar. So without further ado, I'm pleased to introduce Professor Kieran Trehan. Thank you, Kieran.
Thank you so much, Greg. I want to kind of focus on a couple of kind of key areas. I want to start by asking, the question, how can economic development professionals work most effectively with higher education institutes to drive growth? And so the first thing I want to do is to kind of explore what does it mean to work together to create the conditions for economic and social prosperity. So we know that universities are critical anchor institutions. But what does this actually mean? We're the provider of skills, knowledge, research, technology, innovation. These are the core ingredients for inclusive growth. But for me, in order for this to be effective, we have to address the collaboration gap and try and ensure that we create purposeful and productive partnerships so that universities, business, public sector, and economic development professionals work collectively to improve the economy and the communities they serve. So how do we address this gap then? So firstly, I'm making a case for making a stronger alignment between universities, business, and the public sector. And in order for us to do this, we need to create a more inclusive approach to partnerships and engagement. And we do that by harnessing the talent, the innovation, and place. We talk a lot about cities and urban economies and place, but we have to create those collaborative spaces so that we're able to co-locate stakeholders to try and develop new channels for knowledge exchange and integration. It's not enough to just exchange knowledge. That knowledge has to be embedded in order for us to be able to build dynamic capability. And then we also need to try and create more visible pathways, the different pathways that contribute to economic development and potential investment. The second point that I want to make is about the application and the integration to support inclusive growth. And so by alignment, I mean how universities, business, and the public sector, they're complex, but they do provide us with new and exciting opportunities. And COVID-19 has demonstrated our ability to collectively harness that knowledge and talent and skills and to try and facilitate and embed transformational change that makes a measurable difference. So I guess I'm making the case for multidisciplinary challenges that allows us to work together to embed in the fabric of our region and with our partners. And only if we do that will we address the question and create the conditions for collaborative innovation.
Thank you, Professor Trehan. That's very thought-provoking, and this has already generated some questions, which we will get to shortly. We now go to Mark Pearson, who is going to give us an overview from his perspective. Over to you, Mark.
Thanks very much, Greg, and thank you, Trehan, for that those comments as well. I guess in many respects, I'm in a fairly unique position, having spent majority of my career within the economic development profession, but also the last 2.5 years within higher education. For me, I guess I've got a sort of 3 things that I'd like to cover off. One is just the simple scale of higher education in local place. as an anchor institution, as an employer, as an economic driver, but also the agenda that's emerging at the moment around the role of the civic university, essentially that town and gown aspect, which I think is particularly important. Secondly, it's just that whole ethos that, you know, ourselves as Royal Holloway, we're very much a research intensive university. We create a lot of intellectual property, but actually to maximize the benefit of that IP, it's how do we engage with our local companies, how do we engage with national, indeed international organizations to maximize our return on investment, to maximize the income that we can generate. But ultimately, the bottom line with that is how do we actually solve challenges? I hope that most of us today understand that higher education is about taking that academic excellence and translating that into real world solutions. So actually, how does that whole collaborative research work? We recently launched an enterprise task force. We've recently reinvigorated our whole virtual incubation activity as to how we can help entrepreneurs within our local community. And our local community can be quite broad for us, sort of west of London, which is a huge area. But in terms of the third point, and Kieran's already touched on this, it's how do we actually make sure that economic development and HEI actually makes that connection? And how do we actually achieve that real strategic partnership? So it's not just about saying, we do this, you do that. How does HEI support the whole inward investment journey? How does it ultimately deliver those really important skills agendas? And how does it actually transmit that knowledge to the local community? Now, a key bit of that is actually different languages as well. Economic development and higher education talks a different language. And actually part of the role that I've always seen myself in is how do you translate between those different sectors? Essentially at the moment, how do you translate between higher education? How do you speak between policy and delivery within economic development? And how do you translate between business? And for me, if we could crack that, it would be easy. I'll leave that thought with you. Look forward to receiving some of your questions.
Thank you, Mark. That's great. And again, your insights have generated some interesting questions that we're going to follow up on in a few moments. And now we're going to move on to our last panelist. So over to you, John, for your overview.
Yeah, thanks. I suppose one of the benefits in coming last on a panel debate is that colleagues have already covered a number of pertinent points. However, for me, this question raises a deep question for economic development professionals, and that is, what is the type of growth that we're looking to achieve? So whether that growth is jobs based, so a jobs-led recovery, for example, whether it's business, whether we're looking at the business base, looking for a stronger business base, whether it's inclusive economy, inclusive growth, whether we're looking at low carbon, net zero, innovation based, whether we're looking for sectoral models or drivers of growth. And in answering those questions, we can then think about how we can effectively engage and work together and look at driving growth. What's probably common across all of the answers to those questions around what type of growth is desired is that then therefore enables you to understand the strengths and weaknesses of higher education institutions locally, understanding what they do in those areas, so the strengths and weaknesses and what may be improved or what can be worked on together, And then another element which is, I suppose, sort of implicit through all of that is around research and data. So what kind of research and data can support the arguments that you're making, the growth aspirations, and the model that you're seeking to unlock. So yeah, with that as my reflection. Yeah, happy to dive into the questions, and Greg, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, John. Again, some really interesting thoughts. And I've actually just spotted a question in for you. So this creates the perfect link into the next part of the webinar, which is very much around our delegates posting questions or comments. And I see that we have also several questions for Kieran and Mark to follow up on. But firstly, John, the question is, you have obviously two very different universities on your doorstep in Sheffield. In your experience, is either more committed to working with economic development teams than the other, and indeed more committed to supporting the region?
That's very interesting. Yeah, we're in an interesting position that we're one of a combined authorities or local enterprise partnerships that has only two higher education institutions, discounting HE in FE, which also exists in a large extent. So the differences, the two universities are very different in how they engage with economic development, and we welcome that difference, and they also work very differently with each other, which is really positive. Their engagement is very different. Perhaps sort of symbolic of this is their engagement in the local enterprise partnership. So with Sheffield Hallam, you have their pro vice chancellor on the LEP board. With University of Sheffield, it's not the pro VC, it's one of the directors of research and innovation. So that for me is to a certain extent symbolic, but then when it comes down to how they operate, very different again. So University of Sheffield have a dedicated regional engagement team who work closely with the combined authority, the LEP, with local authority officers across South Yorkshire to engage around all sorts of economic development projects, whether that's around research, regeneration, arts and culture, and public realm. With Sheffield Hallam, it's more of a, I suppose, sort of an open door policy. I know the academics there. I have very close relationships with many of them around different thematic areas, and we're there. It's sort of the in this day and age, I suppose, at the end of a Zoom call or Teams. But back in the day, at the end of a telephone line, we knew where to go around certain thematic areas. For example, working very closely with their tourism department or around their Centre for Regional and Social Economic Research. We knew the individuals there. So that for me is articulates some of the differences, but then they also work very similarly on place-based packages, I would say. So at the University of Sheffield, they effectively own the Advanced Manufacturing Research Centre, and are looking at operating that as a sort of an innovation-led place-based model. I would say similarly, the Sheffield Hallam also have a place-based innovation asset, which is looking to unlock growth in the Attercliffe area of Sheffield. So, and there are some striking similarities with that.
John, thanks very much for that. That's super. I've just seen we are starting to get some queries and questions coming through on the Q&A, and I've got one for Kieran, if I may, and this is a question around the Russell Group universities. Traditionally, Russell Group universities are perceived as being more engaged in research and national international reputation, as opposed to more local place-based agendas. Do you think that is shifting? And if so, what might be driving that change now?
I absolutely agree. It's shifting, and it's shifting hugely. So, and if I take the example of my own institution at the University of York, picking up on the point that you raised, John, for me, it's really important for us to kind of think about the conditions that kind of create the economic and social prosperity. And so you have to have anchor institutions, whether they're Russell Group universities, whether they're new universities, and our colleges, working collectively together. And we don't often pay enough attention to the kinds of conditions, the process of working together. We all have great research, we all have great innovation, we all have skills, but you have to utilize that and put that knowledge to work. And the second part of that question is, why are Russell Group universities, even more engaged in this agenda? Because Russell Group universities have a civic mission. Mark talked about a university civic mission. At York, our vision for the future is that we are a university for public good. Well, you can't say that and then not have the activities and the actions. And as anchor institutions, we can't do this on our own. We have the graduates, we have future skills, we have incubation space. And so for me, when I talked about the alignment between universities, business and public sector, it's about creating those collaborative spaces, not just for knowledge transfer. Knowledge transfer is brilliant. We share the knowledge. For me, it's how we utilize that knowledge collectively. And I think, Russell Group universities have an instrumental role to play alongside, all universities. And so it's about saying, what are our strengths? How do we use those strengths, for the public good, but also how do we use those strengths, that knowledge, that experience, not simply to inform, but to engage. So we really create genuine economic and social prosperity.
Brilliant, thank you, Kieran, that's great. And other panelists, is there anything you wanted to add to that at all in terms of thoughts around that from your local perspectives?
Yeah, I think from our perspective as Royal Holloway, recently we were looking prior to the pandemic about our next 10 years through to 2030. We've actually split that into two and looked at the next 3 years through to 2023. But in doing that, so the reason I'm looking, because I can never remember it verbatim, but we've actually gone back to our deed of foundation from 1883 about what we were created for. And that was that we should be founded on those studies and sciences which the experience of modern times has shown us to be the most valuable. Now, it doesn't matter whether that's 1883 or I think we're in 2021 now, so I lost track last year, but actually that's the important piece. So we've got a very broad spectrum as an institution, a very broad spectrum of teaching, of research, and actually it's the focus that we brought back recently, which is actually about the sciences. That's not to say that our classics and our history aren't important, but actually to focus on those areas that where we feel that we can make our, I guess, the most contribution, the most added value in terms of our immediate local economy. Now, we happen to be based fairly close to London Heathrow, on the one corner of a three-site enterprise zone. We're also on the edge of the Thames Valley. And we look at the technology companies that are there and sort of say, well, how can we actually add to their agendas? How can we actually add to some of the global corporates that exist there? But it does come back ultimately to how you can actually build those strategic partnerships. Actually, as a locality, as a place, are we going in the right direction? And I think both John and Kieran have said that very well indeed, that every institution has got a different USP. It's got something different that it can add. So it's not about competing. It's about working together. So as an institution, we're actually based in Surrey. We've got 3 HEIs within the county, but we've actually got a 4th HEI who operates a major international space establishment. They've been doing that since 1965. And you've got to say, well, how does all of that link up? How does it add? And for me, that's the bit that I'm taking from this part of the discussion at the moment, Greg. It's how does that collective add to the greater piece, and whether that's a COVID response, whether that's a Brexit response, whether that's the brave new world of where we're going. But it's about being connected, and it's about adding value.
Brilliant, thanks, Mark. Yeah, and over to Kieran.
I want to build on the point you said, Mark, which I thought you put really eloquently. You know, so if we took a step back and say, what did we learn, you know, from Brexit and COVID-19? Because I think it helps really illuminate, you know, the key question and the purpose of this event, which I think is really important. So we have to be able to kind of flesh out what we mean by purposeful, for me, and productive partnerships and engagement. What are we engaging for? You know, and it's natural for all of us, because, you know, which university, you know, which professional body does not want economic prosperity? You know, those are kind of givens. But what does that mean in the lived experience of working together? And what COVID-19, I think, has shown us, that this sense of community, you know, this shared purpose of working on agendas to revitalise local communities, you know, and the economic landscape. But let's not forget the social landscape and the cultural landscape on that. You know, very often when we talk about economic prosperity, we can't have that if we don't work with some of our backstreet communities, because actually they've shown us the value and the power of that kind of collaboration through COVID-19. So I think it isn't for me about saying what doesn't work, you know, and what are the opportunities. I'd like us to think about new spaces and how we utilise those new spaces, you know, to tackle some of those really big challenges.
Thanks very much, Kieran. That's great. And again, we've had another question in that actually links and develops maybe this theme a little further. And it's been directed to John. So John, if you're okay to open on this particular question, and then if colleagues are happy to, you know, add in as well. So the question is, John, you mentioned various growth spaces. Which would he say is one of the most important growth spaces which can have the biggest impact to drive growth? Example, innovation, job-based, inclusive, etc.
So I can answer that in a number of ways, but 2 ways probably: personally, and then also within the realms of the conversation that we're having. So I'll start within the realms of the conversation that we're having. I am minded for economic growth to be driven by education, skills and employability. And as a result, all education institutions have an important role to play within that, and higher education's role is, I suppose, within the both supply and demand within the economy. Therefore, so it's within the supply of skilled labour, so graduates, students, research and innovation to the labour market. It's also around demand, so it's around supporting business startup, business growth, further sort of strengthening of the business base. So whilst that wasn't perhaps one of the examples I mentioned there, it sort of comes down to the first principles around the types of growth that I think are particularly well supported by higher education institutions. I think there are some really interesting examples of sector led growth, whereby that sector-led growth has been started within universities. We only need to look at across the world at and in fact there's a really interesting Wikipedia article about the number of places called Silicon, and so yeah, it's Silicon Glen, Silicon Valley, Silicon everything really, and usually at the hub of that is a university, and in driving that, it's not just around the internet giants, but it's around developing a particular expertise that is driving economic growth, driving prosperity. I really like I find inclusive growth and inclusive economy concepts incredibly compelling. However, I think there's a really local nature of them that needs to be worked out. Inclusive growth and inclusive economy in South Yorkshire is very different to what it is in Cumbria, to what it is in Cambridge, Oxfordshire, Devon, Cornwall, etc. And we need to understand, what drivers within that. And I think that's why coming back to skills, education, and employability is always a good point to start at around that.
Thanks, John. And just to open that up to any of the other panelists, if that was one that they would like to look at from their perspective.
Kieran, please.
Yeah, I want to just pick up on the point of entrepreneurialism, and enterprise, and inward investment, as part of that process, because often, universities are not associated with that sort of element of it. And I know from my experience of working at York and the kind of work that we're doing, currently about incubation spaces and accelerator spaces and how we work, with the region's entrepreneurs. We talk about large business and we talk about the public sector, but we can't lose sight of that kind of entrepreneurial talent that we have both in our students, but also within the context of our regions. Because if we think about the skills agenda that, John, I absolutely agree with you, education and skills are really, really important. And regions are different. The one size fit approach isn't going to kind of be key. But if we're going to think about economic recovery, and more integrated sort of strategy and vision for the future, then I think we need to make sure that we're putting, enterprise and entrepreneurialism, back in to driving, economic innovation and growth as part of that, but also working, again, collectively with a range of different partners. And in the education and the skills agenda, creating an enterprise all within our curriculum, because they're not just skills for small businesses. Being entrepreneurial has shown us the value, whether you're an academic, whether you work in a large business, or whether you work in public services. So I think it's really important that our universities, our college, and our cross-sectoral partners, come together as part of anchor institutions, to kind of look at the opportunities and the potential for new growth.
Thanks, Kieran. And Mark, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think, for me, we've got to remember as well that there's, despite us being in, are we in austerity still? I don't know. But if we look at the amount of money that's currently being made available through UKRI, through Innovate UK, that's actually accessible via industry, via businesses, but it needs an academic partner to be part of that. And that education, that skills employability is incredibly important. I certainly agree, having worked in various parts of the UK, I agree that one size doesn't fit all, as Kieran has said. But actually, how do we maximize that? How do we take those relative strengths? A few years ago, our regions undertook science innovation audits. Those relative strengths of institutions and of places, whether they're in a 2-3 tier local government structure that we've got it within Surrey, whether they're in a combined authority, whether they're within a city region, etc. I think we've got to focus on. For ourselves at Royal Holloway, we were due last September actually to launch a year in enterprise, whereby we actually put onto essentially a fourth year to any of our undergrad degree courses, so you could actually take a master's in history and enterprise. Unfortunately, because of COVID, that's been postponed. But we're driving forward at the moment with the work we're doing, especially with our students. And it takes me back 30 odd years ago to when I was in my early 20s, and that enthusiasm, that drive that you've got at that age, that boundless energy in some respects to create new business ideas. How do we make this work? And it's astounding when you look at some of the news feeds, some of the local activity where our students behind it. I'm sure it's the same in Sheffield, I'm sure it's the same in York, where you go, oh, hang on, one of our students has done that. And I think if we could only harness some of that, we could tie that into some of the resources that are available from UKRI, from Innovate UK, etc. And ultimately to tie back that into the economic development agenda. How do we keep those people local? It may be, and I'm not being regionalist here, but actually it might be easy to keep people in York and in Sheffield than it is in sort of the west of London area, purely because of cost of living. But actually, how do we retain that expertise locally? How do we nurture that? How do we encourage those graduates, those post-grad, to establish things locally? How do we make sure that we as universities are providing that incubation, that advice, that validation of business ideation, to sort of go, yes, and then also bring the VC money into that, bring the private equity money into that, looking at first, second, third stage funding, etc. And that's quite exciting. For us, that's something traditionally we've not done. Dare I say, we haven't had to. We are looking at that now. And that's really exciting. It's really exciting not only for us as professionals, but it's great for our students, it's great for our local companies as well, who, despite being in lockdown 3.0, continue to knock on our door and go, can you help us?
Thanks, Mark. That's great. And thanks to all panelists for that particular strand of the discussion. I've got a question stroke comment in. It's quite a lengthy one, but it's something that's quite close to my heart, being an ED officer. And so I'm going to read it out in full, and just to sort of nuance the discussion into other areas of the subject. So bear with me while I read this out. It's often universities pushing local and regional place-based agendas. They do it strategically through the voice of the Vice-Chancellor or a member of the senior management team, almost as we were talking earlier. It's a significant emblem, as it were, of the importance of it running through the organisation and the role that they have within that. So economic development professionals, including myself here, on the other hand, are primarily officers or managers handling a range of activities and may not be of the equivalent senior level. So do panelists think this is a barrier? So this is just a general question for the direct relationship between HEIs and economic development professionals, and if so, how do you think we can overcome it? Are there mechanisms there that we could employ to overcome some of the perceived or real barriers? I mean, we've already sort of the panel's already discussed sort of the other organisations such as maybe the LEPs and their involvement in that process as well. But do others in local government need to step up, and who should lead that discussion? So that's a bit of a statement with several questions attached. So apologies for that, but it's a good meaty element to maybe draw out a little further.
Can I jump in here? Probably with
Please
both,
do, Mark. Please
with
do.
both feet, and I say I'll jump in because I've worked in the in the local government sector at borough and county level. I also sat for quite a time on the regional assemblies, if we all remember those a few years ago, and latterly I've worked within higher education, and for me it shouldn't actually be about the title that somebody has against their name. If I receive a call from whether it's we have a principal rather than a VC, but whether I receive a call from him or from the leader of the county council or from the chief exec of one of my districts or from one of my economic development colleagues, I'd see that we're actually all in this together. And I think the best way to maybe example to give that is in terms of the whole inward investment agenda. So I've had the joy of leading a number of inward investment pitches over the years. Many of those have been successful, but actually it's knowing your network, it's knowing your stakeholders, it's knowing that actually I could pick the phone up. Let's use the example of us today, and I could say to I could say to John, so carbon fibre, McLaren, Woking needs to come to Sheffield. We lost that one to Sheffield, but actually it's knowing where that expertise lies. We've got to remember as England, as the UK, we're not that big. We're relatively small, that we should have that ability and people should go, hi, great, and be able to contribute to that greater sum. I remember when I was working in Lancashire, was involved with the potential new chemical plant installation, and the owners of the company were actually had just become an American company from New York, and they said at the time, "Oh yeah, we want to build another plant. We'll look at Fleetwood where we are at the moment. We'll also our next location is Rotherham." And we went, why Rotherham? As we would, we've been protective of our own place. And the answer was, well, to get from where they were in New York to the other side of New York, on the map was that far. Thornton Cleveland to Rotherham was that far. They didn't see that. And we should, I think, be a bit more mature about the way that our relationships all work, the way that we interact with each other. And I'd have, I've got no problem, never had, as you can probably tell, at speaking to people. And we should never bring something to the party.
I think the point that you raise, Mark, are really important ones. And I want to say two things, because I think it's a superb question. We don't talk about leadership, do we, in these processes? And we mustn't confuse leadership with influence. And they are different things. So sometimes, leadership comes with your role and your status, but not necessarily in terms of, the kinds of influence. So I think there is a job of work for us. And, we started that process at York, and it's really powerful that we have to shift perception, because I don't know how much of this is perception and how much of this is kind of reality. But if we thought of our roles, in whatever role we had at the university, as conveners, conveners of productive partnerships and productive relationships, because then I think what we would do is, John, I agree with you around inclusive growth. It's an incredibly powerful term, but you have to have inclusive groups and you have to have inclusive leadership if you want to kind of create inclusive growth. So my response to that question is that we've got to seize the opportunity and grasp the nettle to kind of use and facilitate and convene those kind of conversations, and discussions. Because at the end of the day, what are we trying to do? Well, we're trying to drive through regional innovation. We want to develop skills. We want to contribute to the productivity agenda. Individually, we will make those changes, but collectively, you create a movement, for the kind of transformation that we've been talking about. So for me, I'm back to, it's not about consultation, it's about leadership, it's about engagement, but for a particular purpose. And that might involve different groups at differing points. And you have to have the influence, you know, and you have to have the authority to make some of those things happen.
If I can just add to that, Greg, yeah, I think Kieran and Mark have covered most of what I would cover there. I suppose from our position within the combined authority and thinking about that sort of the leadership that is offered by the universities around elements, I suppose they often provide the strategic leadership within the LEP or advice to the combined authority, and an element of this is navigating how institutions work. And whilst combined authorities are fairly small in the schemes of things, people often don't understand, you know, how that's operated and made up. And I'm forever adjusting or tinkering with organograms to say these are the contact points. These are where we need to be providing advice or putting conversations in. And equally, I think I've got it more or less in my head around how the universities are in South Yorkshire operating. And I think that can then draw upon Kieran and Mark's points around relationships, around leadership, around being mature about where we're pitching that, and also to explore that where's the strategic direction coming from? Is it coming from evidence and research that has been done internally, or is it more about an ambition and perhaps the collective view of how university may want to spend its capital on investing in buildings, for example? So there needs to be a bit of sort of working around it, but I found locally individuals and the institutions very, very supportive in helping navigate that decision making process, really.
Brilliant. Thanks to all panelists for that particular section. That's really useful and some real insight into some of the key elements that may make up what would success look like in terms of a strategic approach. Just shifting again slightly, I've just had a question in on the boards, and it's regarding the levelling up agenda. How do we maximise the role of collaboration between public, private and higher education, so across all three, not just about promoting a high skill valued job market, and I think this is the crux of the question, but how do we support both the foundation economy and those already in lower skill work in terms of the upskilling agenda? So I'll just throw that one out there if I may be that bold. John.
Just to jump in there. So there's the question about levelling up, which in the context of universities and higher education institutions is really interesting, because I don't think we've quite worked out what that is collectively, or even within government, or within probably ministers' own heads, because is levelling up around investment in LEPs, local authorities? Is it around levelling up devolution? So should all areas have similar devolved powers? Is levelling up around outcomes? So is it around the levelling up of job opportunities, or is it the levelling up of salaries, or how deprived or prosperous we are? I think we're not sure where that leads to. However, I think answering those questions and answering where we are across a series of levelling up agendas between ourselves and the universities can help us arrive at where perhaps we need to make the most noise. So around lobbying, particularly. So what areas may we want to lobby on? What areas may we want to do further research, where we need data on, and where do we need more understanding and perhaps more leadership? So I think potentially around devolution is an area where metro mayors have a little bit of not a blank canvas, but an opportunity and a stage to make more of the levelling up around devolved powers. And subsequently, I think that then comes down to the latter part of the question around what does this mean around interventions. And I think by having that discussion with higher education institutions, but also other stakeholders across local areas about where we are at across different levelling up agendas can help us understand what we need to do in those areas. So for us in Sheffield City region or South Yorkshire, high skill, high value job markets, really important that we get there. However, we need to be realistic and we need to think about the journey there as well. So actually this is perhaps more about higher skilled and higher valued jobs than what we're currently supporting, and an element of that is also around the foundational economy, because I think if you're looking at higher skilled and higher value jobs, then the foundational economy is where to start with that, and thinking about how we may support opportunities in those areas, how we may support, and I'm particularly passionate about this, how we may specifically support opportunities rather than sectors. So I think looking at individual businesses and how they may want to grow and pay their workers more, for example, and provide opportunities for progression and so on and so forth. So yeah, it comes down to a little bit of understanding what levelling up is, understanding where we are, and then looking at how interventions may feature and who's taking the lead on that.
Thanks, and straight to Kieran.
Again, thank you, John. I thought that was, really insightful. I want to add another dimension to what levelling up means that, again, often gets sidelined. We talk a lot about, building back better and, building a more or shaping a more strategic response. But we can't, lose sight of the effects of COVID-19 and the disruption and the impact on occupations and how it's affected, the lower levels of skill and productivity, and almost compounded some of the patterns of, disadvantage. And then I think it opens up a different kind of challenge for the levelling up agenda, in the UK. So I want to kind of maybe draw some attention to the work that, Justin Greening has been doing around the levelling up agenda and the levelling up goals, which I think is very complementary to the discussions that we've been having around high skills, incubation spaces. But we also have a responsibility if we're going to create what I call healthy high streets, and viable communities, as universities, as colleges, to think about what the new skills agenda is going to be and going to look like in order for us to kind of, address those big questions of, disadvantage, because we know there will be high levels of, unemployment and people having to reskill. And so we need to kind of put what I call, the digital, the high tech alongside, some of the more practical disadvantages that we are going to have to work with. And that's going to require a different kind of approach, to the ones that we've been, discussing so far.
Thank you, Kieran. That's great. That's really useful. And over to Mark on that particular one.
Apologies for stepping out. I didn't really want my 2-year-old to make a national appearance. I don't mind it with my team, but to a public audience, it's not good. I think the whole levelling up agenda, for some work that we've been involved recently, can sort of be demonstrated by some of the work that came out of our science and innovation audit a few years ago. One of the concepts that was developed out of that was a virtual campus. The idea that, especially picking up on Kieran's point there, and picking up on John's point about that sort of relative prosperity and the interventions he can make, about what can we actually do as HE, but also FE in this particular case, about offering a number of free at the point of delivery courses in bite-sized chunks. and we're doing a soft launch at the moment. I posted it recently on my LinkedIn profile, but we've got a thing called the Innovation South Virtual Campus, and I'll make sure that through the IED that this link's provided, Greg. But we've got a number of bite-sized courses here in digital marketing, through cybersecurity, through collaborative working, through software development databases, through Java, through C++, through software development in terms of Python, web development, etc. And those are freely available. And part of the reason that we developed that range, not just Holloway, but a number of partners locally, Sparsholt College, East Surrey College, and University of Chichester, was to say, actually, for employers and people wanting to get back into the workspace, you don't need a 3-year course. You actually need perhaps some short-term uplift. You need to refresh your skills. So I think when we talk about leveling up and making sure that you've got some of those foundation blocks in place, facilities like this, which in the grand scheme of things, I can't remember the cost. Let's say it's cost £250,000. Quite honestly, that's nothing. It's relatively small intervention monies, and because it's online, you can sit them all. I have signed up to. I'm trying to remember which one I signed up to. I think I actually signed up to our own cybersecurity course, so that I know some of the questions to ask my own academics. But thinking about that, thinking about how you can genuinely impart knowledge to people, how do you get that knowledge exchange across? We're in the process of launching some new virtual incubation space, and actually some of the tools that we've now got available to us, and it's not just this, it's stuff that you can do through Google, through LinkedIn, through institutions, etc. Take advantage of those, and as actually economic development professionals, as educationalists, we ought to be saying to people, go and have a look at those. Go and experience them, and if it's beyond where you want to go, but at least you've explored that. So I think in terms of that, driving that skills agenda, driving up some of that leveling up, and it's not difficult to do, especially not in the digital age. Everything's about Industrial Revolution 4.0. Which I've just about got my head around until I was speaking to some people. I think John knows what I'm going to say here. I was speaking to some people recently, and they went, no, we're talking Industry 5.0. And I'm going, no, I've only just bought into 4.0. So it's having that drive. And I think we're lucky as higher education, we are driving some of that 5.0. Maybe from the economic development perspective, we're still dragging people into that 4.0.
Mark, John, Kieran, thanks for that answer to that particular strand of the subject. With apologies to delegates who have posted questions that unfortunately we're not going to have time to run through, but I do promise that we will actually forward on a summary. I believe there's going to be a blog as well following the webinar. But just by way of summing up, I have spotted one question that does actually do summing up rather well. So just for one final time to each of the panelists, if I may do this, starting with John, is what does Sheffield City Region want from its local universities going forward in terms of the relationship, collaboration to drive growth? And then Mark and Kieran, same question to you, but reversed. What do you want from your local authorities? So just a quick on the spot query to each.
Okay, yeah, so I think we clearly want productive, effective relationships. We want to be on the same page around our priorities, and that means working together around the strengths of the institution. So whether that's around outreach, department research, innovation, regeneration, culture. What I think you can't underestimate the importance of is accessing data. Those on this webinar may know where you can't get an answer through NOMIS. Our local universities will have that information, and sometimes a lot quicker than you think. For example, the graduate brain drain. What's going on in South Yorkshire? Actually, the universities have a pretty good understanding of what's going on and can give you that insight sort of straight away. And we want more of that. And as we make the case for the levelling up agenda for further, powers and further investment, we need that evidence to make that case. So that's a big area for me.
Thanks very much indeed. And over to Mark for your thoughts on that one, please.
I think what I probably want most from our local authority partners and our local economic development colleagues is that understanding that even though local government works slowly, actually HEI works in even longer timescales. We can't simply put on a course tomorrow to meet a perceived need that local industry has. The Innovation South Virtual Campus goes a little way towards that, but we work in 3-year undergrad cycles and significantly longer for MSc and for PhD activity. And actually, it's a career. I do some teaching myself to early career researchers about knowledge exchange, about effective engagement with stakeholders, about the whole IP process, and things take time. And I think we just need to be all aware of those different time cycles that we're in. But most of all, let's just keep working together.
Thanks, Mark. And over to Kieran for your thoughts, please, on that one.
So I've got three key things really, which kind of build on what John and Mark have said. What I'd like us is to continue to work together to build a more integrated and a nuanced approach to kinds of innovation. I'd like us to create stronger pathways, between different departments and the university to ensure that research and development capability is integrated, and that we work, more closely together to apply new ideas, and to try and, create that thriving entrepreneurial business culture that we've talked about. And then I'd like us to harness the work that we forget about that we already do, to kind of navigate through the bureaucracy, to navigate through the small politics, and to show real inclusive leadership. Because if we do that, then we might, attempt to kind of combat, some of the disadvantages that we've been talking about, and provide opportunities and work with us for our school leavers, those returning to education, and think about training in much more imaginative ways. And I think if we do that, then we have a real chance of driving up, productivity and competitiveness, both in local and regional economies, so a nuanced and an integrated approach that's agile and responsive.
Many thanks indeed for that. And I'm just going to add something in. It's coming through the chat, and it's from a local business who is on the call. And I'm going to mention the name. Thanks to Adam Jeffrey. He says more of an observation rather than a question, but I have direct experience of how units have helped me as a small business and local economies in very pragmatic ways. So thank you to Adam for that, because that brings us nicely to a close. And so all that remains for me to do is to say a big IED thank you to Professor Trian, Mark and John for the time today to provide us with some original thinking around how the ED professionals can work closer with HEI. I'd also like to thank all the delegates who attended the webinar. We will follow, as I say, with questions we did not have time to cover. And so thanks very much to all, and have a good rest of the day.
Thanks, Greg. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thanks, Greg.